Now, we have talked about the British Empire during the 18th century and the development of the British Empire, so I won't say all of that again. I think you remember that back in the time of Queen Elizabeth, England was just a very small country, isolated on the edge of Europe, and slowly it built up into an empire that covered a large part of the world. I think you already know that, so let's move on and look at it at its height in the Victorian period. Again, I'm slightly repeating things here, but it was, of course, a trading empire built on buying and selling. It developed through competition with other European countries, and the aim was to control the markets for goods like tobacco, sugar, tea, coffee, cotton, spices, fruit, tropical fruits, and things like that. And the development of British society was closely connected with those markets. The lifestyle of the coffee shops, for example, depended on coffee. And the lifestyle of the tea shops as well depended on tea. The clothes that people wore depended on things like cotton. So the development of the society was closely connected with these markets. People were eating different food, they were wearing different clothes from 100 years before. They were living a different kind of life with coffee houses and tea shops and things like that. Society is becoming much more of a, I've done it again, I forgot to turn off my email program. So let's not hope that not too many people send me emails while we're talking here. Coffee houses and tea shops and the whole urban lifestyle were given a big boost by the empire and its markets that were opening up. And then, of course, the economy, the Bank of England, which dates from the end of the 17th century, the cotton industry. Basically, the Industrial Revolution was largely about the production of cotton clothing. So Britain is too cold. It's not a warm enough country to grow cotton itself. In fact, cotton is only grown in the south of Europe. It's not really possible to grow cotton in Northern Europe at all. And the best markets for the best places where cotton was produced to import from were in America and other hot countries. And then the stock exchange, which was formally founded at the beginning of the 19th century, but there'd been a kind of cabal operating all through the 18th century. So all of these are closely connected with the growth of the empire. And of course, hanging over it all, like a dark shadow, you had the slave trade. The triangular trading system with Britain exporting cheap goods, alcohol, cheap manufactured goods to Africa in exchange for slaves. The slaves then taken to the New World, exchanged for tobacco and coffee and other goods. We mentioned this before, so I'm just reminding you, but a single successful trip could make a man very rich. And in fact, some of the rich families in Britain today, that's how the family became rich originally. So it's something that still has its effect on society today, even though the slavery itself, of course, finished a long time ago. All right, that's the slave triangle. I think I showed you this or something similar to it before, with textiles, rum, manufactured goods going to Africa, slaves going off to the Americas, and sugar, tobacco, and cotton coming back to Europe, particularly to Britain, and people making their fortunes by doing this kind of trading. the song Amazing Grace, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. You know that song? It's supposed, it is written by a slave trader. The romantic version of the story is that he regretted selling the slaves. That's not true. After writing the song, he continued to sell slaves for many years. He wrote the song because he was saved in a storm. He thought he was going to die in his ship, and he didn't. And he said God had saved him. But he still carried on selling slaves. So it was deeply ingrained in the culture of those days. It was abolished in 1833, but by this time Britain was already the most powerful country in the empire was the most powerful political entity over the whole world, controlled from Britain. And so the Victorian period was full of the spirit of the British Empire, the sense that the British are the best. Britain is spreading itself and its culture all around the world. This was the strongest expression of patriotic feeling since the time of Queen Elizabeth. In between, there'd been a lot of, well, there'd been two revolutions, the Civil War and the so-called the Glorious Revolution. There'd been a lot of social unrest and problems, but by the Victorian period, England is feeling comfortable. Britain is feeling comfortable. No big wars going on. Napoleon is defeated. The world all looks rosy. It all looks good. And it was very often expressed for God and country, for God and country. Everything you did was for God and country. The feeling that we're doing our duty to God, we're doing our duty to our country. And God clearly wants us to have this big empire, because if not, God wouldn't put us in this position. So the empire, the idea that the empire was something that God actually wanted the British, the English, to have. And many people believe that God had chosen Britain to lead the world because it was the most advanced country. You'll find that in a lot of the literature of the period. Jane Eyre would be a typical example. If you're a foreigner, well, it's your bad luck. Okay. Sorry, better luck next time. Okay, it's your bad luck not to be so lucky as to be British. That idea is really kind of strong in Victorian times. Of course, I'm not saying that the British are the only people to have that kind of idea. Other people, other countries often have that kind of idea as well. People think they are lucky to be what they are. It's a natural feeling, but it gets very strongly expressed in the Victorian period. So the feeling was that the foreigners were not so advanced, and racial prejudice was pretty much normal in those days. People didn't think there was even anything wrong with being racially prejudiced. It was just, well, shikataganai. I mean, they are not as good as us, are they? So there was a sort of feeling that it was natural. And along with this sense of being superior is this sense of gimu, duty, to spread this wonderful British culture around the world. Part of that would be the religion, Christianity. Part of it would be political systems, although the empire never really spread democracy in places like India or anything like that. But the idea that it was a kind of British mission to civilize the rest of the world. And more then, you're getting a kind of tension growing up between those people who see the empire as a way to get rich and those people who see the empire as it's a kind of duty. We have to educate their children. We have to teach them the right way and so on. Now, in the 18th century, we're mostly seeing people who are out there to get rich. But more and more through the 19th century, you're seeing the idea that they call the white man's burden a duty to make the rest of the world civilized. In the end, the empire ended because it was too expensive. Building roads and railways and schools and hospitals and so on. I mean, that's just part of it. But the social control, just trying to control the people in those countries. The whole thing, the infrastructure, building that kind of infrastructure around the world ended up being too expensive. So it was really an empire that began for economic reasons and ended for economic reasons. The idea that the empire is out there to do people good, to do good in the world, is represented in Jane Eyre, in the character St. John. It looks like St. John, but we pronounce St. John St. John in English. I don't know why, but St. John Rivers. He's determined to give his life to save the people of India, to save people in the empire, because that's his duty, that's his Christian duty, is to help those people. In Dickens's Bleak House, you get Mrs. Jellyby, who is the sort of negative picture of that. She gives her whole life to helping the people in Africa, but her own children aren't getting properly looked after. And there is that feeling among some people in Victorian England that too much is going to help people in other countries. What about the poor people at home? What about the little Oliver Twists and people like that at home? We've got a Victorian point of view here. We can see it here. This is Britannia, who is a kind of symbol of Britain. And she's looking with her telescope at the faraway world, the world of Africa, the world of the empire, poor people, struggling people, suffering people around the world, and little boy saying, please, ma'am, ain't we black enough to be cared for? We're not black, we're not African. Does that mean we can't get looked after? Basically, Britain had a lot of problems at home. And at the same time, this trying to solve problems overseas, trying to solve the problems of the world. It was a situation that was not going to be able to last. Sooner or later, there would be a conflict of interest. And this telescopic philanthropy, helping people who are far away and not looking at the problems at home, ignoring the problems at home. We find that in Dickens's Mrs. Jellyby. We find Kipling's famous poem, The White Man's Burden, which expresses the pointlessness of that kind of philanthropy, saying basically it's not worth helping these people. They're too ignorant, they're too lazy, they won't ever change. So again, it's a kind of misokusabitsu argument. It's jinshu-sabitsu. It's a racially prejudiced argument. You can't help those people. They're too low level. They're too lazy. Instead of thinking, they don't want your help. They've got their own culture. They've got their own life. They've got their own way. It never occurred to somebody like Rudyard Kipling to think about it in that sort of way. So what's happening with all of these different attitudes is that they've got the basic idea, the assumption that Britain is advanced. And by contrast, people of Africa and other colonies are primitive, low level. So St. John Rivers going to save poor souls, Mrs. Jellyby crusading to help the poor of Africa, Kipling insisting that these heathen, pagan people don't deserve help. Behind all of them is the idea that the white man, particularly the British white man, and inside the British, specifically the English, the idea that the white man is superior. So Britain has nothing to learn from other countries. Britain is just there to teach or to give of its own wonderful culture. The idea that the world might not want that people might say, Indian people, for example, might say, we have a culture that's thousands of years older than yours. Leave us alone. The idea that other countries might not want British culture forced on them didn't really seem to come into people's heads. They seemed to think that it was God who'd chosen Britain, God who'd chosen England to civilize the rest of the world. That way of thinking continues right up until World War II, really. And we call it colonialism. And you've probably come across the idea of post-colonialism, which is the idea that grows up after World War II. But wait a minute, you've got this all wrong. You shouldn't be spreading your culture around the world. Or, I mean, there's nothing wrong with William Shakespeare. There's nothing wrong with industrial revolutions. There's nothing wrong with all of this stuff necessarily. It's just that you do have to respect other people just the same as you expect them to respect you. You have to have give and take here. So the idea that there needs to be some kind of give and take in Britain's relationship with the world is something that is really, we're seeing it growing up mostly after World War II. Until that period, you've got the idea of having a big empire and controlling the world is the right thing to do. We don't have anything to learn from the world. The world can learn from us. So, colonialism and post-colonialism. I'm going to jump straight to America I'm going to jump to Australia because America has already become independent. By the time that we're looking at things in the 19th century, America is an independent, separate country. But of course, before America became independent in 1776, it was a place for British people to go. British people could, if they weren't happy with their life in Britain, they could go to America. They could make a new life. And then after 1776, the focus shifted more to Australia. Although people continued to emigrate to America, but Australia became a new kind of focus. And of course, basically the empire was a way of spreading British people and Irish people all around the planet. People went to these different colonies and they ended up staying there. James Cook discovered, or he claimed the east coast of Australia in 1770. Colonies were established by the end of the 18th century. And just like America, you had colonies and you had penal colonies that people sent as prisoners, convicts. One of the things I talked about, different kind of punishment, was instead of hanging them, which is maybe the government thought mottainai, once they're dead they can't work, send them off to work, make them labor as convicts, as prisoners for 7 years, 10 years, 20 years, whatever it might be. Give them a punishment like that, and then once they were set free, they would again typically stay in that country and live the rest of their life there. Some would come back, but mostly they didn't. And Dickens shows a lot of this, particularly Australia, We've got John Edmonds in Pickwick Papers. We've got Mr. Squeers in Nicholas Nickleby. We've got David Copperfield with Uriah Heep. We've got Magwitch in Great Expectations. These are all people who've been sent to Australia as criminals, as convicts, sent there to work. Magwitch comes back in Great Expectations. Mostly it's people being sent away from England to Australia. And we've got David Copperfield, with several characters in David Copperfield who go to Australia and make a new life for themselves. And the message seems to be that if you're unsuccessful in Britain, you can have a second chance. You can go to Australia in the 19th century, America in the 18th century, and maybe other countries, other parts of the empire. So that there's this a double bonus for British people. They had this trading empire, but they also had the opportunity to go and live, spread themselves around in other countries. Quite important to think of that if you think that at the same time Japan was sakoku. Okay, it was a closed country and people could not really travel outside Japan very easily at all. And people from the outside could not get into Japan either. Japan, people sometimes talk about similarities between Britain and Japan because they're both island countries on the edge of a big landmass. But our history is almost opposite in that respect, isn't it? Britain went out into the world and had its big empire stuff. Japan closed itself down and said, no, thank you. We prefer to keep the world outside. So that's something to think about, I think, from a Japanese point of view. So, yes, in Great Expectations, we have Mr. Micawber. Now, he's been having difficulty in England. He's a good man, he's a nice man, but he's not very good with money. And at the end of the story, he goes off with another family, the Peggotties. He goes off to Australia. He gets into a high position. He becomes a magistrate, a respected man in a new society. Another character in David Copperfield, Martha, she can put her sexual scandal behind her and find a husband in Australia. At the end of David Copperfield, half of the characters in the book just sort of go off to Australia. They can have a new life. They can have a second chance. So the idea that if you're British, you're privileged, because even if you fail inside British society, you can get on a ship and go to another country and start again. Okay, there's that kind of idea was around. I don't know what's going on here. The PowerPoint doesn't seem to want to work very well, and I've made several attempts to record. This is my last attempt to record. If it doesn't work, I'm just going to have to put it up silent for you. So here we go then, one more time, attempting to record the story of the non-white colonies in the time of the British Empire during the Victorian period. We have colonies like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the colonies in North America until they became independent, which were essentially white, and the indigenous inhabitants were overwhelmed and white culture became the predominant culture. And then we get territories where the local inhabitants remained the majority, and either because they were already very, very well established, and then we've got slave populations, non-white populations that were brought in and then outnumbered the whites. So you've got these two types of colony. In both those types, the whites would be a minority. India is the sort of prime example, really, because it was considered the jewel of the British Empire, and it had been controlled in the 18th century by the
East India Company, and then from the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century, it was controlled directly by the British Crown. And it's a country that still has strong relationships with Britain, with 1.5 million people or so of Indian origin living in Britain, and a lot of investment by Britain in the UK into India, and by India into the UK. So there's a two-way investment going on. There are still fairly close ties between the two countries. And the Caribbean was also, much of it, under British control. And here you've got a slightly different situation where large numbers of Africans were taken as slaves. And they were freed during Victorian times, continuing to work as labourers on the plantations, some of them, others choosing a different kind of lifestyle. And then Africa, which had been ignored really until the later part of the 19th century, apart from one or two settlements on the coast for the purposes of slave trading. Starting with India then, we have Clive of India taking control of India from the French during the middle of the 18th century. And we can see here how there's a very vibrant, very strong Indian culture. It's a society that's been going for thousands of years, and the arrival of the British is something more of an assimilation. They can't control this entire population. Well, they do control them in certain ways, but they certainly can't enslave the entire population, although some Indians were effectively enslaved and forced to work in mines or in other occupations. But you can see how it's a kind of adventure playground for the upper class British men who go there as colonial officials. This is a cockfight, which we can see going on in the foreground. By the middle of the 19th century, the British presence in India is very well established, and so these same colonial officials are now taking their wives with them, typically, when they go to India, because it's become a more stable sort of setup. And they would, in those days, probably leave their children behind in boarding schools, although by the early 20th century, we get books like Francis Hodgson Burnett's The Secret Garden, where the little girl was actually born in India, and white people would be having their whole families in India, and the family would grow up together in India. So you go from having the sort of adventurers, the male adventurers in the late 18th century, to taking their wives in the mid-19th century, and then by the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, it would be not uncommon for them to be having whole families in India. The Caribbean, a different sort of story. It's rather similar to the colonization of the eastern coast of America. Basically, the native populations were unsuitable for slave labor, and slaves were imported from Africa. Jamaica would be a typical example. It had been a Spanish colony until the middle of the 17th century, when it passed into British control. And the Spanish, of course, had attempted to enslave the native population, as all these European colonialist conquerors did, but the native population was more or less completely wiped out by disease and by war, and so they started importing slaves from Africa, which the British carried on doing when they took control. So they used African slaves to produce cotton, tobacco, and sugar. Those would be the main products in those days. And of course, the number of slaves was much, much greater than the number of white colonists. By the end of the 18th century, you've got about 250,000 slaves, as against some 20,000 white people. And there's a smallish number of freed people of color, black or mixed race people who have been given them their freedom for some, in some circumstance. The production of sugar went down, partly, it says here, largely because the freed slaves chose to set up their own communities of subsistence farming. I've done a bit more work since then, and I found that some of the reason for the decline in sugar was because Caribbean sugar is made from cane, which is easy to produce in a hot country, but it has to be transported, where Britain was more and more developing sugar produced from beet, which is a root plant, which is a cheaper way of producing sugar. So that was another reason, actually, why the sugar market was declining. But part of the reason was that the freed slaves didn't really want to carry on working for white masters on the plantations, as they had been forced to as slaves. Even if they were being paid for it, they would rather find another way of earning a living. And because the black population, the African population, was not keen on doing that kind of work, the British now started to import workers from other areas, such as India, so that today you have quite sizable populations of Asian origin in the Caribbean. So it's quite a culturally mixed area. And here you can see that it's very unlike India. Rather than mixing in with a culture, it's simply two segregated cultures, the master class and the slave or servant class. Slave up until the 1830s, and after that servants, but the relationship still being very much a power relationship, with masters at the top and slaves or servants underneath. Whereas in India, although you have some of that going on, you've got an ongoing local culture, which the British have to find ways more or less of fitting in with. And although I have said that the black people very often refused to work on the plantations after emancipation, after slavery ended, it still went on. And we've got many sugar plantations still being run by black labour. Even if the labourers are no longer slaves, it's still going on into the late 19th and early 20th century. So, Africa. This was an area that Britain and Europe had not taken much interest in until the 19th century. Mostly it was an area, well, they simply wanted to have access to coastal areas where they could bring their ships and load them up with slaves and then move off to the New World. South Africa would be a bit of an exception because it was a richer area, the climate was better, and there were natural resources, jewels, diamonds. Of course, South Africa is famous for its diamonds, and it was competed for by the British and the Dutch. Please note the difference between South Africa, which is a country at the south end of Africa, and Southern Africa, which is a region which as a whole is poor. South Africa is a relatively rich country. Southern Africa includes many poor countries, sub-Saharan areas which are lacking in natural resources and have a very hot and harsh climate. So please note the difference between South Africa, which is the name of a country, and Southern Africa, which is a region. Okay, so once the slave trade was made illegal, merchant adventurers started looking for other possibilities, like, as I say, diamonds and that sort of thing, mineral resources or any other alternative sources of wealth. So they started looking towards the interior of Africa. this was not really a very easily accessible area. Disease, hostile inhabitants, and desert, jungle, swamps, environmental difficulties made it an area that was not very accessible to white people. David Livingstone is the most famous of the Victorian adventurers, and there were quite a lot of women actually who penetrated into Africa and South America, into the most extraordinary, surprising places. So there were quite a lot of female adventurers from that time as well, and their travel books still survive. So we've got some quite interesting accounts written by women as well as by men. But basically, you had to be tough. And then in the later part of the Victorian period, from the 1870s onwards, you start to get what is called the scramble for Africa. And European countries are competing to take control of land that they had previously been happy to leave well alone. This didn't really last for all that long, but it had a huge effect on what Africa is today. From the 1870s up until the middle of the 20th century, much of Africa was controlled by various European countries. Britain, of course, being one of the major colonialist presences in Africa. There was a major conflict with the early Dutch settlers and the British, the Dutch settlers known as the Boers, and the Boer Wars went on from the period of 1880 to 1881, and then again at the end of this century, 1899 to 1902. And Britain was severely criticised by the world for its treatment of the Boers, which was pretty unpleasant. And also, the British suffered the shock of being beaten by the Zulu people. They never thought that they were going to be beaten by the native people of Africa, who they considered to be much more primitive than themselves. And so Britain was beginning to question its position as a sort of all-powerful colonialist nation at the end of the Victorian period. There's beginnings of self-doubt. So firstly, here is Livingstone being carried through the jungle. You got the sense of the white explorer. If he could pay for black servants to transport him, he would be able to make his way through the jungle, but he would not really be capable of traveling, walking. Well, I think here he's actually, he's unwell, he's got a fever, he's sick, and so he needs to be carried. Other times, of course, the explorers would walk, but they were not adapted to the climate, they were not adapted to the environment, and so it was a very difficult thing for them to make their way into the interior of Africa. And here we have the Zulus beating the British, and yes, giving the British a bit of a shock here, well, quite a big shock, as they realise, oh, we can't actually control even people that they considered primitive, were savages. Those people could fight back, and they could beat the British. And I think the British were quite taken aback by that. We often talk about this as being a century of peace, and we will see that inside Victorian England, huge reforms took place, which is typical during periods of peace. But during the entire period, there was fighting going on in the colonies and in other parts of the planet, which the British were deeply involved in. So it's only century of peace in a limited sense, in the sense that at home in Victorian England there was peace.
To finish off with, I'd just like to point out that we don't see very much evidence of the empire in the literature that we read. We have to very often study the history and think about the background to the novels in order to understand the context of empire. It's not very often mentioned directly. We've got, in the 16th century, we've got Richard Hakluyt writing about his voyages, and we've got early explorers in that time, in the 16th century. We've got an extraordinary novel by a woman from the 17th century, Aphra Behn, who herself, when she was a little girl, traveled in South America, in Suriname, and it seems as if she's writing about her own experience. But there are large gaps. All through the 18th century, the literature doesn't seem directly to mention the empire very much at all. We have to know the context when we look at something like Daniel Defoe. Do you remember we talked about his Moll Flanders? Okay, yes, Moll does get sent to the Americas, but most of those 18th century novels have very little mention. We've seen several of those 18th century novels. Most of them don't really mention the empire in any direct way at all. Robinson Crusoe talks about a castaway. It doesn't really talk about the colonies. Gulliver's Travels it's a fantasy. It's not a real place. None of it's real, the places that Gulliver visits. And the satire is all about Britain and British politics. You have to understand British politics to understand Gulliver's Travels. It's not about colonization around the world. As I say, Moll Flanders is one of the exceptions. It does mention at least Moll is sent to America. The Gothic novels, I already mentioned before, they often set the background of their stories in remote, exotic places, but that's just for the sense of the mysterious. It's not really talking about the real experience of the British colonies or the British Empire around the world. It's some fushigi country, zutto muko no fushigi na tokoro, some weird, exotic experience. It's not realistic, usually. And in the 19th century, nearly all of the novels of the 19th century focus on life in Britain, and the empire is only hinted at from time to time. Oops, another email. Sorry about that. Mr. Rochester, for example, in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, owns land in Jamaica. He's married to a mixed-race Creole woman from Jamaica. So she comes into the story, but she never speaks. Rochester's wife is locked up as a mad woman. Oh yes, going back to women's madness. She's considered mad. She's locked up in Rochester's attic. And she never speaks. I think it's a typical example of the silence that we have about the colonies, the silence that we have about the British Empire in the 19th century. Bertha Mason, Rochester's wife, locked up in the attic. We never hear what she might think. We never hear what her version of history might be. So the story is taking place in England. She is a mad woman in the attic. We never hear her voice. Towards the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, we get writers like Rudyard Kipling, Rider Haggard, Joseph Conrad. They start talking about the colonial possessions of India. They start talking about Africa as real places. And they're writing about them as real places. it really isn't until the end of the 19th century that we get significant writings about the empire. During most of the period of the empire in the 18th and 19th centuries, there's a kind of silence in the literature. Only hints about the empire. Rich people sorting out their business affairs, hinting that the money comes from plantations in Jamaica or something like that, trading, possibly in slaves even, trading with other colonies and so on, but not really saying very directly, not really talking directly about the empire. It's interesting to see how little of the empire comes into the literature. So the British Empire is more conspicuous by its absence in Victorian literature than by its representation in Victorian literature. We don't really get very much detail about it directly in the literature, except for some travel books and so on, but they are not bungaku, they're not literature as such, they kind of travel, different genre, they're not fiction. The novels, the shosetsu, the novels that you're reading, or that you're going to read for the literature of the 19th century, mostly don't talk directly very much about it. You have to kind of think about the context, because they're not saying it directly. So it's an interesting topic. I think it's a very interesting topic for writing about. One of the reasons that it's so interesting is because the writers say so little. And you have to sort of think, at the time that this was being written, they were still slaves, for example. Or at the time that this was written, what would be happening in the empire? What would be the political story in a bigger picture? Because the writers themselves don't talk about it very much. Okay, well, I've spent longer on this than I expected to, so I'm not sure if we're going to get through the second presentation, but I hope this has been useful. And let's just take a little break for a couple of minutes.